Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for having me today at this webinar. And I'm Mathieu Lemay, CEO of Inocybe Technologies. We are a company that has been um, quite involved in open source networking, so we make it usable for people to leverage open source networking through our products and platforms and so on. And today I'm actually going to talk more generally about open source networking in general. While it is a webinar and it's likely going to be more of a one-way conversation or thing, I invite you guys to stop at any time and ask questions in the chat so that I can make it a little more interactive, so you actually will find the session enjoyable. So thank you very much for having me here. I hope it's a nice day in Russia today, and I will get started right now on the talk. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the impacts of open source networking in the industry. We started open source networking or being involved in open source networking pretty early on. Like in 2005, we had a platform that was or a set of tools that would allow research and education networks to actually leverage open source networking to orchestrate and manage their networking. So we've been at this for quite a while, even before the whole software-defined networking era. And for us, it's really about the concepts of applying open source to networking. Open source has been eating the world. It's quite predominant into the IT sector. So compute, storage have been leveraged via a variety of open source initiatives. Look at today's internet, which is mostly powered by Linux operating system. So open source has been, and most phones are now, well, a lot of the phones are now Android devices. And therefore, you can see that open source is a movement that has been growing from a software perspective and taking a larger and larger place in the industry. So today, my talk is really about how that applies to the networking environment, and especially what are the pitfalls and the mistakes that people do when they actually try to leverage open source in their environments. Right. So let me talk a bit about Inocybe before I even get started with the rest of the talk, because you guys will likely wonder, like, why is this guy just talking about open source and so on and so forth. So Inocybe's journey went through a variety of iterations on the business model, because we've learned how people were trying to leverage open source and how they actually, what were the challenges they were facing. Initially, when what we did as Inocybe, as I mentioned earlier, we were more involved with the research and education networks, automation and orchestration of these networks. And then what we ended up doing is joining the OpenDaylight Foundation. So we joined the OpenDaylight project very early, and because it was it was a good fit for our activities at that time. So we joined into 2013, shortly after the inception of the project. And our model there, when we initially joined, was, oh, well, we'll kind of do the Red Hat model, because no one is shipping a distribution. Most people are trying to productize it, and productizing open source is always a challenging thing. So we knew about that. And what we had is more of a support and services model. So we had a distribution, we were selling support for that distribution, and then we would also sell services around it. So that model actually was successful to an extent. However, we found that a lot of people required custom services around it. Like, they didn't want the pure open source piece, or like they had to customize it, adapt it for their environment, their needs, what they were actually trying to achieve, right? That's one of the advantage of open source, is that you actually are not locked into a particular set of feature, particular product, and so on and so forth. So people come to open source for that openness, And if they're stuck into we only support these pieces of the distribution, or like it ends up kind of being a challenge and competing with some of the proprietary products out there. So what I believe is, and moreover, when you look at this business model, the margins are quite low. Therefore, it's very difficult to make it profitable compared to other business models, because or proprietary or anything else, because you cannot re-inject because of the low margins. Very difficult to re-inject the margins into the product development. Therefore, what happens is open source builds much slower, and then the features are not as robust because there's less investment inside the actual product of being built. So, so that was the reason why we looked at ourselves back then, and we said, okay, how can we automate the services that we are doing for people? How can we automate ourselves and remove us from the equation? So back in 2016, what we did is we created like we took a full year to create an intelligent platform that analyzes everything, analyzes the open source a little bit. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Black Duck, but it's a little bit like Black Duck, which does the analytics of the open source project, but very geared towards open source networking, all the requirements, and how do you actually leverage all these puzzle pieces from an OpenDaylight or the project's perspective. So we started with OpenDaylight, build your own controller. So how do you actually build a controller that makes sense out of the different components? Because OpenDaylight was always more of a bag of parts than anything else, right? So that's why we actually took that approach. Is most different people wanted different things. Some people wanted an SDN controller, other people wanted a WAN controller, others want an IoT controller, and you can build all that from the OpenDaylight project. But the choice of the components, the permutations, it's almost a completely different distribution or build or whatever you want to call it. And so we wanted to allow the end user to pick and choose, like a little bit like a menu, what they would actually build. So that's in 2016 how we've evolved our approach to open source networking through automating ourselves and delivering a platform. And when we did that, what the response was, it was very positive from the industry, because people wanted to have that flexibility of adding their in-house code, mixing it with a supported distro, like having the ability to kind of package the complete solution and deploy that into production. So we've been the partner for production deployments of this with some of the operators in a large enterprise. And what they were starting to ask is, okay, you do the controller piece, but can you also do the same for the data plane or some of the other projects out there, open source projects that have been appearing? So we started generalizing the platform to allow people to build their own open source networking stack that they would be able to deploy into production. So that's where we come from, and that's why we really believe in open source networking, and we have a lot of experience of user interactions around that open source networking story. So our goal and our role into all this ecosystem is to try to unify or help people unify open networking, because there's too much fragmentations, too many pieces here and there. And so we're trying to make it simpler for people to build a stack or assemble this, because otherwise you would turn to your system integrator and basically like kind of trust the system integrator to put all the pieces together. You sometimes end up with a very customized version of it, makes it hard to change, or you get locked into the services model, which is not always desirable for some of the end users. So what's the open source advantage? Why open source altogether? I've mentioned open source versus proprietary product, and why open source has been kind of growing. Well, for a variety of reasons. This comes from the Black Dog's Future of Open Source survey on the left. initially, or if you look in 2015, most of the people were going for open source to have the access to the source code was an important thing for them, because if anything happened to the organization or whatnot, I mean, they're not stuck. They can actually could try to pick it up on their own, or someone else can pick it up. And we've all seen what happened with OpenOffice, LibreOffice, and so on and so forth. You know, the people stay the same, the strategies might change, the companies might change, but at least there's less risk in leveraging open source. Then you have the ability to customize and fix. I've mentioned that a little earlier in the webinar, which is people wanna they have a bug or they found something, they don't necessarily want to wait for the vendor to completely fix it. They will fix it and might submit a patch to the community, or they will work with the vendor into fixing it in a timely fashion. So the response time for these fixes is usually much faster than the traditional process, which brings agility to the end user. It's also a big the ability to customize, that's important. The ability to customize um, is really about like how does that fit into my particular environment compared to the off-the-shelf. If you look at some, especially in the SDN world or the networking world, there's always subtle differences or little pieces or a specific piece of hardware that might not be from your favorite vendor solution or whatnot. And so there's a lot of need for customization in a specific case, or integrating it with the OSS or the BSS or the custom systems that are in place. So people really turn to open source. And in the networking world, it's obvious, but the ability to customize that is fundamental. Then in 2015, there was the total cost of ownership. People were trying to cut costs. They wanted to uh, open source has a lower TCO. If you look at the whole thing, open source not free most of the time. You will either try to have resources in-house, work with a vendor like us, which is dedicated to open source and open source networking in particular, uh, or, um, um, or basically try to work with the other services company that would potentially leverage it in a particular way. So in the end, it can become costly. In fact, in some cases, it could even exceed the cost of a proprietary solution if things go out of control. However, when things are done right, the total cost of ownership will go down, because you will not have the same type of huge costs caused by the lock-in of the vendor. Moving forward. Uh, then in 2016, it was less about costs. It's starting to become about the features, the innovation, the ability to go faster in the industry, because there was this urgency that's happening. If you look at the operator market, for example, the cost revenue convergence, the fact that people are paying only X amount of dollars for their services, internet, and so on, and the costs due to IoT and bandwidth demands in mobile is increasing. It creates that gap in between the two curves that operators are trying to address. And so in order to address that, they need to be more competitive. They need to work on emerging services, and and of course lower the capex and opex costs. So what we find is that allows you to have the competitive features, freedom from the vendor lock-in. You also have the quality of the solutions. More people working on it, it's better than this little product on the side. So when you have a lot of people in a community around the open source, like a project like OpenDaylight, for example, you have a lot of people that are working at making sure it works, and that it works in a variety of scenarios. So the core becomes very solid. The edges might need a little bit of a fix, and there's some issues here and there, like any open source project, but the solutions are becoming much more of quality. And If you look at from an open networking, so that's the SDX Central survey on the right, which platform has been deployed from an open source networking the most. Of course, OpenDaylight comes in at 61%. It is the dominant open source framework, but there's also ONOS that comes in at 23%. So when people are doing more of an OpenFlow centric network, that would likely be their choice and preference. Ryu is good for an OpenFlow fabric that you want to script with Python, agility from an SDN perspective. And then Open Contrail is basically successful in clouds environments. The other ones are a little more of a legacy set of controllers and a little less active, well, still active, but less talked about these days. So where's the what's happening from an open source networking? Well, if you look at the Linux Foundation, that's the Linux Foundation stack. There's more and more projects, more and more pieces, and that fragmentation is addressing a variety of projects in the stack. So what's the next step? The next step is to try to unify that and provide frameworks of reference where these things work together. So there's our large efforts in trying to make a sense out of all these pieces and how it actually applies into the different environments. So OpenDaylight, Panda, ONAP, OPNFV are all and FD.io are all kind of related and working together. Some of the other ones there are actually alternatives that you can use to leverage. Of course, Open vSwitch, everyone knows about this one, also integrates well with OpenDaylight or ONOS for the matter. So when you come up with an open source networking strategy, you need to first start with the approach that you need. Some people will want to go completely do it yourself, which I likely will not recommend. I've seen a lot of horror stories where people are just trying to leverage it. If you look at some of the OpenStack deployments and other things, when people try to do everything in-house, they actually need to dedicate a lot of resources and a lot of time at understanding the rate of change, understanding what's happening in the community, and so on and so forth. So if you want to do it yourself, you just don't download it and install it. You actually need to participate on very actively within the communities that create that source code. You need to have that knowledge. You need to be involved. So I would advise anyone going into the do-it-yourself route to be completely invested into the upstream, which we call, which is the original source code from the open source projects. And then you have the other opposite side, which is the products. The products is what you would expect from your vendor, which will have packaged, managed, quality tested, hardened open source project, and created value add on top that is sellable as a product. So you have a productized version of the said thing. So it could be an SDN controller, or it can be a IoT controller, and so on and so forth, depending on what has been built as part of the or a complete end-to-end solution. So products are available as a finished thing. So people need to choose in the spectrum based on their internal resources, what they're planning to do, and how they're planning to address the problem, where they fit. Do they want a product that is turnkey, standalone, and finished, or do they want to have a flexible do-it-yourself strategy? I find that in most discussions with people, they seem to be hoping for something in the middle. They want the turnkey experience of they still want to have diets, and so that's why, like ourselves, we kind of positions ourselves as the best of both worlds. But people will have different needs, and some people don't have any internal resources and will expect a off-the-shelf product. I install it, it works, it solves my business problem. Okay. Other people are really investing a lot of time and effort on the open source project itself and are going towards the do-it-yourself route. As I mentioned earlier, open source is not free. Well, it is, but it's closer to getting a free puppy. So there's two things in life. You actually would be very happy if someone handed you like a free beer or something, or a free meal or anything like that, because you just consume it and then that's good. However, if someone would come to your house and just give you a free puppy, you would think twice. You would say, yeah, I'll need to take care of it. There's a hidden cost to it. I have to feed it. I have to make it grow and so on and so forth. So um, open source is a little bit like that puppy. In other words, it is something that evolves over time and that needs nurturing and attention to be successful. So you need to make sure that when you leverage open source, that you understand all the costs. So you can either partner with someone that does it with you or for you as a vendor, or you actually do it yourself and you nurture that puppy, as I've mentioned earlier. So as it grows and evolves over time, for example, OpenDaylight, it can become unwieldy because it grows into so many directions and creates so many level of complexity. When OpenDaylight started, it had only 13 different projects. Now it has over 80 different pieces or projects. Some of them are good, some of them are not. Some of them are completely unusable, and others are actually good to know or leverageable. A variety of use case. So someone without that understanding could very easily get lost into the massive size of this. Like OpenStack had some of the same issues where there's so many projects in there. And of course you have the core projects, but then what do you leverage out of that, or what are the side projects of the big tent that actually make sense, and so on and so forth. So these big open source projects have um, the downside of their strength, which is they become big. Uh, Also, when you establish an open source networking strategy, you always need to have that champion. The champion is the person that will make the case within the organization. He is essential because open source is in the industry or in the networking realm is new. I mean, when you start talking to procurement, when you start talking to other portions of the organization, they will likely not be familiar with the open source or the open source business models and so on and so forth. So that's why it's so important to have that champion that wants to change things, because the de facto default is just to buy the off-the-shelf product and then install it. So when you start with an open source strategy, you need to first decide why are you going that route versus the proprietary product. Is it the flexibility? Is it less risk? Is it more transparency, more influence? Like all the things I've mentioned earlier, which ones are the real drivers for choosing the open source um, road towards towards the networking challenges, and um, and then the champion needs to really master some of these open source technologies, have great communication skills within the organization in order to be able to push that forward. Needs to influence. It needs some influence within the organization. And what we find is if it's more of a junior person or trying to make a change and bring into the managers, sometimes they won't listen and so on. So like for the open source strategy to be very successful, it needs to be the engineering team really working with the management team and understanding what are the benefits, what are the cost benefits of adopting this. If you look, like CenturyLink just made like as an operator was claiming $100 million a year reductions in their costs just by leveraging some of these open source projects instead of um, other proprietary products. So, and finally, of course, people need to have access to budgets for either personnel, working with open source vendors, or or having the ability to buy the right hardware and everything that's required. So that becomes a very, very important um, trajectory in creating the open source so, solution. So what are the top 5 impacts of open source networking? Well, one of the uh, main challenge or change is that if you look, especially in the operator model, it's been very capex centric. So they buy boxes, they buy fiber, they buy a lot of capital expenditures. So if you look at the internal models, they're all built around buying a lot of upfront cost and minimizing the OpEx cost. If you look at the total cost of ownership, that's likely more than um, some of the challenge, some of the total TCO of open source, but a capex license is easier for them to buy than continual cost. If you look at the open source business model, it's usually either SaaS or support or something that's more of a recurrent fee. And why is that? It's because open source is always evolving. It's not like the typical product that you buy, it works, you don't touch it, you have the license, it's going to work. Open source is constantly evolving, and therefore the OpEx becomes it is closer to an OpEx, whether it's personnel or a SaaS model or a support model with your vendor. The OpEx is a big part of it. You can try to turn it into a CapEx cost with a very large deal for 5 years or something like that, but most people um, uh, the procurement is going to be a challenging place where things need to change for a successful model. It ends up costing a lot less to the company, but the machine is usually not built to do these type of deals. Then, of course, there's the cost. Um, so as I mentioned, depending on the size of what you're building and what you're doing, you might have huge and significant savings. The bigger the network or the bigger the environment is, of course, the bigger the savings of leveraging open source. Because if you look at a proprietary product, it is cheap at the beginning, and it really becomes quite expensive as you scale up inside the organization because of all the license fees and the tax and these and that and so on and so forth. Um, from an open source perspective, it is usually a much lower price than the proprietary equivalent, and allows you to have like customizations and so on and so forth. So depending on the type of project, you have a lot of customization, or is it something more off the shelf? Off the shelf definitely would be cheaper with proprietary products. When you start having customization and specific needs is where open source will definitely shine and give you the cost of effectiveness that you're trying to achieve. So depending on the number of use cases and things that you are trying to do with the platform or the product, you will have to make a decision based on it that would impact the costs and total cost of the project. Another impact of open source networking is no vendor lock-in. We've seen a lot of M&As or acquisitions. For example, TLF got bought by Cisco. Viptela was also bought by Cisco. Like people choose smaller vendors because they provide innovation. They provide also uh, an alternative from the big vendors out there, and usually they get bought out by the big vendors afterwards. So and then that usually will not frustrate, but yeah, will actually put the customer into a situation where he didn't want to work with the big vendor, but then he ends up having to work with the big vendor because they've acquired the company. So they don't like that, and they also don't like the fact that they can't change or swap vendors if they're not satisfied or delivering and so on. So open source allows you to have a selection of different vendors and have almost of a not necessarily a drop-in replacement, because sometimes there's the 80-20 rule where the vendor will have a bit of value add, but at least you will have most of the core and most of your application that will still work even if you make a change. So the impact will be minimized and doesn't change the complete architecture of the network or the complete architecture of the strategy. So that's one of the biggest strengths of open source. And for example, OpenDaylight, choose any OpenDaylight based vendor and you will have a lot of similarities on how you can leverage it and use it in your environment. Also lowers the risk, as I've mentioned. Uh, People with the M&As end up in a risk situation because then they don't necessarily have a plan B and they've invested a lot into a particular product or a particular strategy. So it creates a lot of risk within the organization. Open source lowers that by giving alternatives. And worst case, people can even go into the do-it-yourself road if things don't work out well. We also believe it's fundamental to smart infrastructure. If you look at smart cities, smart building, and all these initiatives, especially because of what I've positioned earlier, how can you make a 25-year bet onto a technology? Like who's going to buy it, who's going to own it, what's going to happen there? So these smart city projects are usually a 25-year project or a 25-year infrastructure that will be amortized and used as a utility within the communities. And so open source becomes very important to the deployments of these, for example, data utilities or open networks because it actually minimizes that risk I've talked about earlier. So you can take a 25-year bet into an open source initiative, knowing that you can just get involved in the community if things don't go well, and you won't be locked into a specific product. Of course, there's risk that the project or like there will be less committers, less traction, less activity. That happens with any open source project. It matures, it becomes a little less hyped, but I believe that it is part of the cycle and process, and then it actually comes back and people start putting more efforts into it. So the will comes back after a certain time and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk a bit about the top 5 mistakes that people make when they try to implement their open source networking strategy. Uh, the biggest mistake I've seen is people going in with no business case. So basically, just kicking the tires and learning about the technology. We find that while it is the de facto behavior, people will just want to get familiar, understand what it does, and so on and so forth. It actually misses the point a lot because the value in open source is in solving the business case or solving a particular business problem. I like in all the engagements we've had with people, it's rarely been about the technology or like I'll say like, I have an open flow switch. I want to make sure that I can push the flows and do this or it has to be driven by a business case. Otherwise, it will never um, go anywhere, most likely. I mean, there can be the kicking the tire phase into the whole strategy, but the strategy needs to be lined up into why people are actually doing this in the first place. And sadly, people get distracted by the shiny object or by the shiny object behavior. They've heard about it. They want to know what it is. They need to understand it. They've been told the buzzword by management. And so that's what I always advise against is before going and exploring SDN, try to figure out what needs to be solved. Is it optimizing the core network? Is it um, automating some of the team of people that needs more agility and so on and so forth. So it has to start from what is the mission that is being achieved. Better BGP optimization or better content delivery of the traffic or more security. So what's the business case will basically need to be the driver for this. As I've mentioned, open source networking is not a product. It's not something off the shelf. And if people are expecting that, they will usually, first of all, be disappointed. But second of all, will uh, there's missing documentation, so it's not a finished product. So it's really the product versus custom software type of situation, and people need to know what they're getting themselves into when they choose open source. Um, Another issue is maintaining a local fork or copy. For example, if someone would say, "Okay, I'll go and download all the OpenDaylight source code, and then we'll start using it for our organization," and you keep the local copy and you start making changes to it. That will end up with a divergence with the upstream community and the upstream code that will be very, very hard to unify afterwards. It leads to a technical debt, and because of the rate of change of the open source project, they change quite a lot based on the number of committers and people involved and so on and so forth. Um, it becomes then very hard to reunify things together inside something that will be successful. So doing upstream first with a little bit of a buffer, so like having the ability to push a patch quickly and so on is important, but keep very close to the upstream as much as possible. Another problem with open source networking is throwing too many cooks to the problem. So I'll take an example. Okay, our engineers are cheap, not cheap, but I mean they are not costly, and therefore we can put a team of 35, 40 people on this, and they will learn and do that. That is a challenging thing because just throwing people at the problem usually will not solve it. Projects like OpenDaylight or some of the open source networking projects are very complicated pieces of code that requires a lot of experience, expertise, and know-how. Therefore, having the right persons do it is more important than the quantity. So think of it more as a quality versus quantity project. So if you are embarking in this journey, really choose a smaller set of high quality people versus just putting a massive force to the problem. Even if, yes, there's a lot of lines of code, it is huge projects on Apple OpenDaylight and this, I mean, among the largest project open source projects in the world, but just putting people around it um, is not the best solution. It can lead to that what I call Frankenstein code base, like pieces here and there that don't make any sense with the rest of the code, and no um, nothing that holds it together in a very solid way. Finally, the last mistake that most people will make is they're trying to reinvent themselves as a software company, especially from an operator's perspective. Of course, they understand that they're competing now with Google or Facebook, or I mean, especially in the U.S., and that these guys wants to disintermediate the operators from the equation. They want to go direct to the customers. So their competitors are these enterprise software companies. So they say to themselves, I need to become a software company as well. Some people can do that turnaround, like AT&T has been quite successful at attempting that turnaround so far. It's not an easy feat to do, but I would advise against that for the majority of folks because it is a very, very difficult pivot to do, and better focus on the internal expertise. You have like people, especially on the network operators world, will have a lot of great internal network engineers, great talent, people that know how to orchestrate, manage, and um, deliver the networking piece of it. So it's more about automating yourselves or automating what behaviors you would want to do from that packet pushing or that packet management behavior than trying to become a completely software-oriented company. Work with partners, work with software or with some of the vendors even to do that software piece or even a size to work out on some of the software side and focus on um, uh, the network challenges because these two pieces go hand in hand and they're very important. So just trying to flip it into a software story is a very, very challenging exercise, and we've seen a few horror stories about that as well. So that's why I'm saying trying to work with partners instead of reinventing completely the organization. We all understand there needs to be a change, that it has to be software driven and things will go towards a software solution, but it has to happen more gradually and not more like greenfield slash clean slate approach to it. So um, So that's basically the bulk of my presentation, the impacts, the mistakes, and a bit about open source networking. I would invite you guys to join the OpenDaylight Russia meetup group that is local to Russia. We've been working on that with Factor Group, one of our Russian partners, and the OpenDaylight Foundation. So I would definitely invite you all to participate, be involved, and work with that community to learn more about what these open source networking tools can bring to your environments and solve some of the business cases and challenges that you might be facing. Um, on that, I would thank you very much for the opportunity to do this webinar. I hope it was an interesting and insightful view on open source networking, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions that the participants might have. What SDN protocols do I like? Um, aha. That honestly, I don't like or dislike protocols. I think they all can fit different needs or different. I like a mix, and I personally you believe in OpenFlow, okay? Yeah. So basically, I was involved in the early spec of OpenFlow. I helped write the 1.1 version of it, which didn't really end up. Like in my opinion, that would have been the nicest one. 1.3 is compromised so that it fits on the ASIC. But so basically, OpenFlow has good advantages for some of the use cases. I've helped start a company called NoviFlow. They sell high performance OpenFlow switches and so on and so forth. So and now they're quite successful on that. And so I completely agree on the OpenFlow, but I'm very protocol agnostic. I believe that there is a right approach to the networking challenges based on what's being achieved. OpenFlow is great if you want to have like it's closer to a glorified firewall. So it actually it's really gives you insight into the TCAM rules and the way you would do your forwarding from a packet perspective, um, uh, um, uh, which is basically um, uh, based on that particular set of things. And so um, lost my train of thoughts. But from an OpenFlow perspective, like from a different protocols, sorry, back to the protocols. NetConf great for NetOps when you're working with vendor gear, allows you to model things. Also, if you're looking at an IoT story and you start having sensors, a NetConf approach to it, which gives you a unified model of the world, is very interesting approach. And then, yeah, OpenFlow is definitely on the packet processing view of the world. Right. What's the currently mostly used protocols, netconf for projects, and SDN and white box switches. Okay, um, so I would say that a lot of the projects today are closer to a NetOps or a network automations projects. We'll usually use BGP or BGP or netconf and a mix of both. On the edge, we're starting to see some OpenFlow. OpenFlow is great, has some, like the protocol itself has scalability issues in the fact that uh, like whatever controller you're using will start to saturate on the echo and the IO of the exchanges of the way the actual keep alives are done and everything will start to saturate at about 1,500 connected devices to the controller. So that's why you need to have the horizontal scaling per controller and so on and so forth. And from a white box perspective, again, it depends because we're working with people like PK8, which on the PCOS, which is more of a OpenFlow centric white box. In other cases, there's people that want a netconf white box because they want to have a more of a traditional look and feel to the problem. And again, it depends on where you want to put the functionality. Do you want to put the functionality at the controller level, or do you want a modular open white box switch that allows you to turn on or off a variety of localized functions? And there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It depends on how you architect and address the problem, because some of the logic and some of the intelligence you will want to have it localized on the switch. Like even on OpenFlow switches, we have projects where you put a mini version or an embedded version of a controller on the switch in order to do the local decision making. Therefore, it ends up being almost the same as a vendor switch because now you're no longer separating the forwarding information from the control plane and or the data plane from the control plane, and it all comes back into a box. And there's reasons why networks were built this way for a long time. And when you start having scale is where you will want to put more localized intelligence, just because centralizing doesn't scale at long, from a mathematical perspective. So you will want to have a bit of a localized function, but I like having the application or having the holistic view of the network at the controller layer. You will want to have that. So like doing device by device is also not the answer. So it's really a compromise between these two approaches, and this needs to be balanced well into the network design. It can't be just, it's not a single side of the coin. I hope I've answered that one. So what do you think about vendor-backed open source solutions like OpenContrail? Um, so I think that from a productized perspective, Open Contrail is a good solution. If you look especially on the cloud use case, there's a lot of uh, Open Contrail really shines. It was designed for OpenStack integration. It's solid there. It has what it needs to do and achieve. So if you're focusing on a particular use case, these vendor-backed open source solutions are closer to a product than these big umbrella projects like OpenDaylight, which some of it can compete with OpenContrail, but other pieces have nothing to do with it, and so on and so forth. So I believe that vendor-backed solutions like OpenContrail are lacking a bit of a community, though. I mean, there's sometimes it gets hard to push some of the changes. I know that especially in the OpenContrail uh, example, some customers ended up being a little bit frustrated that they couldn't get their changes in, and that happens all the time with vendor-based open source because there's no real guarantees that your contributions will get in. Like look at Open bSwitch, the reason why they're trying to create more of a community around it is for a long time people were complaining that it's very hard to get a patch in because it's very difficult to get the contributions accepted. Now they've been much more receptive, and the guys have been listening. They're great people, so they have been listening to that comment. But sometimes it's not that they don't want to. It's mainly that they don't have the bandwidth to review and manage and do everything that's required to merge the change, and they don't know how good it is and why it's important, and it's not well presented. So the vendor-backed solutions suffer from some of that single organization open source issues, which, yeah. What do you think about debugging of an open source stack? It's hard to find what layers work small. Yeah, okay. So I agree with that. I think that's why people need more tools or more things around it from an open source networking perspective. Like if you're, for example, you have an open source switch and then you have an open source controller and open source apps, where's the problem? Where does it lie? Is definitely a valid statement. We've had a lot of environments where problem was at OpenVSwitch and just the way they were, processing packets. So OpenVSwitch would behave different than, for example, the NoVFlow switch, and then or a Pika 8 switch, and would simply process the packets, the OpenFlow protocol, very differently. So because of that, it does make things harder to validate from an end-to-end perspective, which is why you need to have good interfaces and good testing at each of the interfaces of your layer. Um, Moreover, in our case, our approach, what we've been kind of preaching is more testing of the end-to-end. That's why we kind of went into our platform model that allows people to kind of test the full stack and the full end-to-end, because that's where things come up. Just testing the controller piece usually will not be sufficient. And then when things go wrong, it's really about identifying where things where the issues lie, and that's usually useful with a few of the dashboards and tools. For example, yeah, there's a few dashboards we've had it or that the community has that allows you to visualize more what's happening. If you have to go into the stack trace, I agree, it becomes very painful. Any other questions? Thank you very much, Alexander. Good questions. Any Anyone else has anything to ask? Happy to ask anything, even the difficult ones. Answer any. Perfect. Well, thank you, guys. I hope it was interesting. I'm happy to. You can reach out to Madison or myself or anyone from our team or other people. And thank you very much for organizing this. Uh, and happy to answer any other questions offline as required. So thank you, guys, and look forward hearing more about you soon.